At my mother-in-law's graduation dinner, I noticed a chair was missing. My husband chuckled, "Oops, guess we miscounted." As the family laughed, I told him, "I'm not family," and walked out. Then minutes later, they discovered I owned the real venue, catering everything. I 29F. Never thought I'd become the villain in my own marriage story, but sometimes life pushes you into corners you never expected to occupy. The evening started like any other family gathering. My mother-in-law had finally completed her master's degree at 58, and my husband insisted we celebrate properly. He suggested hosting the dinner at what he called that fancy place downtown, the same venue I'd been quietly building my catering empire from for the past 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me, though he had no idea. My husband had always been dismissive of my business ventures. When I started the catering company, he'd rolled his eyes and called it my little hobby. When I bought the struggling restaurant space and transformed it into an elegant event venue, he barely acknowledged it existed. To him, I was just playing house with other people's money I'd inherited from my grandmother and invested wisely while he focused on his corporate ladder climbing. The family arrived in their usual chaotic fashion. My sister-in-law swept in wearing designer everything, immediately commenting on how quaint the venue looked. My brother-in-law made jokes about the decor being very Pinterest-y. My mother-in-law, bless her heart, seemed genuinely pleased with the elegant setup I'd personally overseen that afternoon. That's when I noticed it. The table was set for 8 people, but there were only 7 chairs. I counted again, thinking I'd made an error. My husband's parents, his sister and her husband, his brother, my husband, and me. 8 people. 7 chairs. I approached my husband quietly and pointed out the missing chair. He glanced over, and instead of looking concerned or apologetic, he chuckled. That sound, that dismissive little laugh, cut through me like glass. He announced to the table that they'd apparently miscounted the seating. The family erupted in laughter, as if this was the most amusing mistake they'd encountered. His sister joked about how someone would have to eat standing up. His brother suggested we play musical chairs. Even his mother giggled behind her hand. But nobody moved to fix it. Nobody called for another chair. They just laughed. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. They'd planned this dinner, discussed the guest list, and somehow I'd been an afterthought. Or worse, not a thought at all. My husband caught my eye and shrugged, still smiling. He told me not to worry about it, that we could grab another chair from somewhere. But his tone was casual, unbothered. Like this was perfectly normal. That's when something inside me snapped. I looked around the table at these people I'd been trying to impress and please for 4 years of marriage. People who'd never once asked about my work, my dreams, or my accomplishments. People who saw me as an accessory to their son and brother. I told my husband very calmly that I understood now. I wasn't family. I was just someone who happened to be married to their family member. The laughter died immediately. His mother looked confused and started to protest, saying of course I was family. His sister's expression shifted to something between guilt and annoyance. My husband's face darkened, and he told me I was being dramatic and making a scene. But I wasn't making a scene. I was simply stating a fact that had become crystal clear. I gathered my purse, told them to enjoy their dinner, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard my husband calling my name, his voice tight with embarrassment. His mother was asking what was happening. Someone muttered about hormones or sensitivity. But I didn't turn around. I walked straight to the kitchen, where my head chef was putting finishing touches on the elaborate meal I'd personally designed for the celebration. I told him there'd been a change of plans. The party was cancelled. All food service was to stop immediately. He looked confused but nodded. My staff knew better than to question my decisions. I'd built this business on clear communication and decisive leadership. Within minutes, the servers who'd been preparing to deliver the first course were redirected to other tasks. I then walked to my office. Yes, my office, in my building at my venue, and made a phone call to the front desk. I explained that there had been a misunderstanding about the evening's reservation. The space was no longer available for private dining. The family would need to make alternative arrangements. From my office window, I could see the confusion spreading through the dining room. A server had approached the table to explain that the kitchen was closed and they'd need to leave. I watched my husband's face cycle through confusion, anger, and then dawning realization. His mother looked mortified. His siblings appeared to be arguing among themselves. And my husband was pulling out his phone, probably trying to call me. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat in my office and did something I should have done years ago. I really looked at my marriage. I examined the patterns I'd been ignoring, the dismissals I'd been accepting, the ways I'd made myself smaller to fit into their family dynamic. My phone buzzed with increasingly frantic texts. My husband demanding to know what was happening. His sister asking if I'd lost my mind. His mother, surprisingly, sending a message that simply said she was sorry and wanted to talk. 20 minutes later, my husband burst through my office door. His face was red with embarrassment and anger. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, humiliating his family like this. He said I was acting like a child, that this was supposed to be his mother's special night. I let him vent. Then I calmly explained that I owned this venue. That I'd built this business from nothing while he'd been dismissive and unsupportive. That I'd personally planned every detail of tonight's dinner, from the menu to the flowers to the custom playlist. That I'd done all of this to honor his mother's achievement, despite the fact that his family had never once acknowledged any of mine. The color drained from his face. He asked why I'd never told him about owning the venue. I reminded him of all the times I'd tried to share my business successes, only to be met with patronizing smiles and subject changes. I pointed out that he'd suggested this venue himself without realizing his wife owned it, which said everything about how little attention he paid to my life. He tried to backtrack then, saying he'd always been proud of me, that he just didn't understand business stuff. But we both knew that wasn't true. He understood business perfectly well when it came to his own career. He just hadn't considered mine worth understanding. The rest of his family had gathered in the lobby by then, looking lost and confused. Through the glass walls of my office, I could see them huddled together, occasionally glancing in our direction. His mother kept wringing her hands. His sister was on her phone, probably trying to find another restaurant that could accommodate 8 people on short notice. 7 people, I corrected myself. They'd only planned for 7. My husband begged me to reconsider, to let them back in, to salvage the evening. He promised things would be different, that he'd pay more attention, that he'd make sure I felt included. But these weren't promises born of genuine understanding, they were panic responses to an unexpected consequence. I told him I needed time to think. About us, about our marriage, about whether I wanted to keep trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I didn't belong. He left then, rejoining his confused and hungry relatives in the lobby. I watched through my window as they filed out of my building, probably heading to some chain restaurant that could seat them immediately. My mother-in-law was the last to leave. She looked back at the building, at my building, with what seemed like newfound respect mixed with regret. Update 1. The next morning brought a flood of messages. My husband had apparently spent the night explaining the situation to his family, and the responses were varied. His sister sent a long text about how I'd embarrassed the entire family, and that successful people don't throw tantrums. His brother's wife messaged to say she'd always suspected I was high maintenance, and now she knew for sure. But his mother surprised me. She called early in the morning and asked if she could come by the venue to talk. Not to apologize for me, not to smooth things over for her son, but to actually see what I'd built. I agreed to meet her. She arrived an hour later, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen her. I gave her a tour of the space, the main dining room with its restored original brick walls, the smaller private rooms I designed for intimate gatherings, the state-of-the-art kitchen where my team created everything from simple business lunches to elaborate wedding feasts. She was quiet through most of the tour, asking thoughtful questions about the renovation process, the business model, the challenges of running a hospitality company. When we finished, she sat down in the main dining room and looked around with what I can only describe as wonder. She told me she had no idea. Not just about the venue, but about any of it. She said her son had always described my work as event planning or party stuff, never mentioning that I owned a successful business. She'd assumed I was working for someone else, maybe doing weddings on weekends. Then she said something that broke my heart a little. She told me that in all the years I'd been married to her son, she'd never once heard him talk about being proud of me. He talked about being proud of his promotions, his golf game, his fantasy football league, but never his wife's accomplishments. She apologized for the chair. She said it hadn't been intentional. They'd been planning the dinner over a group text, and somehow the count had gotten confused. But she admitted that the fact that none of them had immediately noticed I was the one without a seat said something troubling about how they saw me in the family dynamic. I appreciated her honesty, but I also pointed out that the chair was just a symptom. The real problem was that I'd spent 4 years trying to prove I belonged in a family that had never made space for me to begin with. She asked what I was going to do about my marriage. I told her I honestly didn't know. Update 2. My husband came home that evening with flowers and a reservation at my favorite restaurant. He'd clearly been coached by someone, probably his mother, on how to handle the situation. He apologized for not recognizing my business success, promised to be more supportive, and suggested we could start fresh. But as he talked, I realized he still didn't really understand what had happened. He saw this as a communication problem that could be solved with better attention and more date nights. He didn't grasp that the issue was fundamental, that he'd married me without ever really seeing me as a complete person with my own ambitions and achievements. I asked him to tell me about my business. Not just that I owned a venue, but about my business. What services we offered, how many employees I had, what my biggest challenges were, what I was most proud of accomplishing. He couldn't do it. After 4 years of marriage and 3 years of me building this company, he couldn't tell me basic facts about how I spent 40 hours of my week. But he could tell me detailed statistics about his co-workers' fantasy football performances. That's when I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with flowers and dinner reservations. This was about respect, recognition, and whether he saw me as a partner or an accessory. I told him I was going to stay at my sister's for a while to think things through. He panicked, asking if I was leaving him, begging me not to make any permanent decisions while I was upset. I wasn't upset anymore, though. I was clear-headed for the first time in years. Update 3. It's been 2 weeks since the dinner incident. My husband has been calling daily. His family has been sending mixed messages ranging from apologies to accusations, and I've been running my business and thinking about what I actually want for my life. The venue has been busier than ever. Word somehow got out about what happened, probably through his sister, who loves drama, and instead of hurting my reputation, it's actually brought in more clients. Apparently, there are a lot of women who appreciate a business owner who won't tolerate being disrespected, even by family. I've also been meeting with a divorce attorney. Not because I've definitely decided to end my marriage, but because I need to understand my options and protect the business I've worked so hard to build. My mother-in-law has been the most surprising part of this whole situation. She's called several times, not to advocate for her son, but to ask about my business and share stories about her own career struggles. She told me that watching me walk out that night reminded her of moments in her own life when she should have stood up for herself but didn't. Yesterday, she asked if I'd cater a small celebration for her actual graduation. Just her, a few close friends, and the family members who genuinely supported her education journey. Not her son, who'd made jokes about her going back to school at her age. Not her daughter, who'd complained about the time and money being wasted on education. I said yes, because this was never about punishing her. It was about refusing to accept being treated as less than I am. My husband still doesn't understand why I won't just come home and work things out. He keeps saying that all marriages have problems, that we can fix this with counseling, that I'm throwing away 4 years over one bad evening. But it wasn't one bad evening. It was 4 years of small dismissals, casual disrespect, and being treated like a supporting character in my own life. The missing chair was just the moment I finally saw it clearly. I'm not sure what comes next. Maybe we'll find a way to rebuild our marriage on a foundation of actual mutual respect. Maybe we won't. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never again accept being treated like I don't belong at my own table. The venue is thriving, my team respects me, my clients value my work, and I've remembered what it feels like to be proud of myself. Whatever happens with my marriage, I'm not going back to being invisible in my own life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to accept unacceptable treatment. Sometimes walking away from the table teaches people more about your worth than years of trying to earn a seat ever could. And sometimes, owning the building gives you options that nobody saw coming.